and welcome back to the Insemination. We've got a beast of an episode for you. Coming on today is a titan in the advocacy world. We have Dr. Tober, who is a professor of medical anthropology at the University of Alabama. Dr. Tober has received multiple grants. She is an author, and she's been cited in so many different publications and just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to egg donation. And Dr. Tober has been researching egg donation, specifically how egg donors are treated within the United States, side effects, and risks. And please remember that insemination is both visually filmed and recorded. So if you are a visual learner like myself, the full thing is filmed and put on YouTube for your convenience. And if you have not subscribed to our podcast, please do and drop a rating and a comment. Please also follow me on social media at Laura High Five to make sure that you never miss an insemination beat. And with that, let's get to the episode. And welcome to Insemination, Dr. Tober. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I am so excited to have you on this podcast. I've had an eye on you, eye on your work, and I feel like it is so utterly important to talk about right now, especially in the age of social media when there are so many clinics and cryobanks recruiting donors on social media without any context. And so I'm so excited to kind of go in the weeds with you.
Great, thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
So before we get started, I just want all of my listeners to kind of, I kind of want you to flex a little bit. I'd like for you to sort of share your caliber because, hey, we love a woman in science. That is something we certainly appreciate. So first, I would love to talk about your background because you have received several grants supporting your research, and I'd love for you to kind of go into that.
Yeah, well, the largest grant that I received and the most significant grant that I received was the one from the National Science Foundation. It was a multi-year grant, four-year grant. Well, it got extended because of COVID because it cut into my research. But in any case, the focus of the grant was to examine the medical markets of donor eggs in the United States and Spain, and to compare these two very different regulatory and cultural systems surrounding egg donation, and very different medical systems as well. And that was almost a $500,000 grant for what turned into a 4-year project. So it was very supportive of my work. I'm very grateful to have been able to do it. And the culmination of that grant now is several articles that I've recently published on egg donation, as well as pulling it all together. Now I'm in the process of writing a book about it. So that's very exciting to try to dig through all this work that I've done for the past number of years and try to bring it out. So
now I'm very excited about that. I know you've got your first book on the table, and I would love for you to show everybody your first book, Romancing of the Sperm.
Romancing the Sperm. The second book is not named after a movie.
And what is the title of your second book, and when should people be looking for it on a bookshelf?
Yes, the title of my second book is Egonomics, Egg Donors, and the Global Fertility Industry. And that's the provisional title. It may change by the time it's published. I'm due to have it to the publisher in March of 2024, and it should come out in the fall of 2024. So
amazing.
I'm really excited to get that work out.
Oh, I look forward to reading it.
Yeah.
And you are a professor of medical anthropology. Would you mind explaining to the audience what exactly that is?
Well, in a nutshell, medical anthropologists look at different aspects of health, healing, culture around the world. So, for example, I have many colleagues who have done their work on HIV in Africa, for example. I have other colleagues at University of Alabama who take a more ecological kind of approach to studying biometrics, urine, blood, those kinds of things in response to environmental stressors. My own work focuses on lay perceptions of genetics. So what we think is genetically heritable and how that's embedded in culture and how that affects these things like the donation industry. So how eggs and sperm are transacted, why we value this kind of a donor gamete more so than this one, looking at some of those ethical questions surrounding how we think about the marketability of eggs and sperm in these different social and cultural contexts.
Okay. And what inspired you to sort of go down this path? What is your origin story?
Well, it's interesting. When I was an undergraduate at San Jose State for a while, I had this medical anthropology course, and all of a sudden, one day, I had this epiphany, like just a light bulb, literally went over my head, and I'm like, "Aha! I'm going to become a medical anthropologist, and someday I'm going to go to Iran and study a women's health issue in an Iranian village." That was sort of like in my head because I had friends that were Persian speaking at the time, so I'm like, that's what I was going to do, and
Talk
I
about
did
your
end up.
manifestation. I mean, that is specific. I love
It
it.
was like, yeah, it was like my path was laid out, right? And so I start once I had that vision in my head, then I could finally start getting A's in my classes, And then I kind of mapped out what my next step was going to be, which was ultimately to go to Berkeley, because that was like sort of in my sights.
Mm,
And when I was at Berkeley, still we didn't have much ability to travel to Iran as a student or as a graduate student. The visa situation was very difficult, and I didn't have any contacts there.
yeah.
Um, and so, in the meantime, I was working with Professor Gay Becker on her on her projects examining gender differences in response to infertility. So, as part of that group, I was interviewing, and her research focused only on married couples who were going through infertility, using donor eggs, using donor sperm to create their families, and that was in about 1991. So I did that as a research assistant, and then women were calling up to participate in her study that were single or had a female partner,
Mhm.
and they were being turned away because they didn't fit the scope of the study demographic, which was heterosexual married couples, which was at the time the definition of infertility was you had to be trying in a heterosexual relationship for a year or more in order to be able to even get a diagnosis. And so I thought, A, it seemed a shame to me that people wanted to tell their stories and we had to turn them away. And
Yeah.
B, I thought it would be a really interesting project because nobody had, at the time when I first started, nobody had done that yet. After that, people like Linda Kahn, she also was around the same time looking at lesbian families and so on. But at the time when I started the project, nobody had really done that. And so as an outgrowth of her research, I started my own project looking at sperm donation among same-sex female couples and single women. And then a year after that, I got to go to Iran and study Afghan refugees after I got my PhD. But initially, what started me on this path was Gay Becker and her projects on infertility.
Amazing. And why? And so kind of going back to your studies, because specifically like right now you're studying egg donation in Spain and the United States.
Correct.
Why those two countries? I mean, I know that you live in the United States, but specifically why those two?
Well, one of the things so I had a number of Spanish colleagues, and one of them came up to me at one of the conferences, Nancy Convalinka, and we started chatting. And she had seen I had done a sort of a short clip of my film that I was working on, The Perfect Donor,
Mhm.
and it's still in post production. I'm still trying to fundraise to finish it, but
Yo, I'm pitching my documentary as well. I totally hear how that goes. It's tough.
yeah. I have a 20-minute clip that I was showing at the conference. And so she came back up to me afterwards and we started talking, and I started realizing how different the landscape was in Spain from the
Mhm.
United States. And then the following year, in about 2015, I went to a medical conference in Spain. I was invited to go present some of my work on egg donation there. And in talking with some of the professionals there in the medical community and also in the anthropological community, it started dawning on me that the Spanish system is very, very different than the US system.
Mhm.
And it would make an interesting cultural comparison, not only to look at how we logically think about these two different systems and based in very different sort of philosophical, ethical
Mhm.
frameworks, but also one of the burning questions I had is egg donor care better in a more regulated system compared to an unregulated system or underregulated system like we have in the United States? Or is it different? And if so, how is it different? And how do women's decisions within these two different structures vary according to the cultural and medical and regulatory context?
In what way is Spain better regulated or more regulated than the United
Yeah,
States? I will now Spain is a anonymous donor only, which like as a donor
right,
conceived person, I do not support. But
exactly.
I would love to know what do you mean by a more regulated country?
So as early as 1988, the Spanish Fertility Society and the Spanish, legal system, legislators kind of came together, and they realized, okay, we've got assisted reproduction happening. We're using third-party gametes. How do we regulate this in a way that makes sense? And one of the things that was on their mind at the time is they didn't want to use the US as a model, where things seemed, from a Spanish perspective, somewhat chaotic.
To say the least.
Yes. And so they wanted sort of a system that made sense, that fit with their cultural and philosophical and ethical values, that they could rally around and support, to allow egg donation and sperm donation for everyone, but in a controlled way. And at the time, in the United States as well, anonymity was pretty much the way everybody did it, right? Many of the donors that I've spoken to, and most of the clinicians that I've spoken to, still, even the clinicians still say anonymity is best, but we know with ancestry testing it can't be done anymore. Well, Spain has not yet gone down the ancestry testing path like we have here in the United States. So in Spain, well, let me backtrack again. So going back to the regulations, they really wanted to have, as a system, as a country, a system that made sense and that fit with their ethical values. And so they came up with, over several years, a span of about from 1988 to then again about 2006, that single women could have access to donor eggs and donor sperm. Lesbian couples could have access. Surrogacy was going to be banned, which it still is, for a variety of other reasons, because they didn't want a surrogacy market. And they wanted to curtail the donor compensation to be only to help with sort of the time and the trouble that it goes through, and not be something that was going to entice a woman to donate eggs because she had economic hardship.
It's not a for-profit.
It's not a for-profit for the donor. And even for the medical professionals, it's not as profit-driven. It's starting to become more so now because of the drive of private equity and venture capital into the medical market globally. But at the time, it was not. And so there was very much this desire to not be commercially motivated, which I completely think makes sense.
I would agree.
To the U.S. market, which is very commercially driven, basically like on steroids, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's
commercial.
Commercial. Yeah, that's our bread and butter. That's our foundational stones.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I was interested in these two things, and then of course the anonymity thing, as you mentioned, Spain does require donor anonymity, and also in Spain, doctors or clinicians select the donor on behalf of the intended parent. So intended parents cannot choose their own donor.
Ooh.
And the clinicians select donors based solely on the degree to which they match the recipient. So, if I have blonde hair, blue eyes, my donor has to have blonde hair, blue eyes. If I'm type A positive blood, my donor has to be type A positive blood. And so they have a number of different sort of mechanisms within the clinical setting to ensure a phenotypic match between donor and recipient. And it's solely in the hands of the clinic. The intended parents never see a photograph. They never get any information about the donor. They might find out okay, she's a student or something like that.
Yeah.
But it's all very vague. And donors don't receive any information about the intended parents either, because it's all under this anonymity. Now, of course, as you mentioned, as a donor-conceived person, that is problematic.
Yeah.
And also for donors, that's also problematic as well. So for example, when I was interviewing donors over there and surveying donors, even if they said they wanted to be anonymous on their survey, when I started talking to them, they would say things, well, actually, I'm really curious and I would be open to more information, providing more information, or I would be open to meeting them down the road, or I would be open to. So the way they thought about anonymity in conversation was very different than the way they answered on a questionnaire. So I found that very interesting. And then most of the physicians, like the physicians here at the time, and even still, would say, well, if we get rid of anonymity, we're not going to have any more donors. And in fact, what my data shows is that you might lose about 5 to 10%, but not enough that's going to significantly impact, your ability to still have an industry, so to speak. And so,
And I
I'm sorry.
also no, and I also very much I very much believe that you will actually get the right donors.
Right.
You will
Right.
get donors who are actually even more of because the fact that they're like, we don't want to overpay our donors because we don't want the finances to be an incentive, because I understand they're trying to collect altruistic donors.
Right.
And when you take away anonymity, there is going to be a little bit more of you are going to be faced with a little bit more of what you did. And,
Right.
and I mean that in the best possible way.
Right.
And it does call upon more altruistic
Right.
donors, because
And,
it's
and
not,
to be more thoughtful.
you
Yes.
have to be
Yeah.
more thoughtful because you will meet your biological child.
Right.
And there are so many people who I talk to who are like, I would love to be a donor, but anonymous donation really makes me uncomfortable.
Right. And those people can find a place
Hmm.
where they can do non-anonymous donation. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously in the United States it's doable. In Spain it's not.
Yeah.
In Spain you can't even bring your sister in to be your known donor.
Yeah,
And
that's
so in Spain,
unfortunate.
if you want to use your sister to donate eggs for you, you would actually have to go to the hospital, the private hospital, the hospital or the clinic, and have your sister be a donor to somebody else anonymously, and then that somebody else would find a donor for you anonymously. So
Mm,
it's like an exchange program, right? But it
yeah.
still has to be maintain anonymity. So I do find that piece to be problematic.
Yeah.
But I'm there to sort of make observations and not
Of
to pass
course.
judgments. Of course, as an anthropologist. But and on the other hand, and one of the things that I see with the fact that the donor selection process is in the hand of the clinics instead of being in the hands of the intended parents is that it completely removes that commodification of human eggs in that regard. So when you have intended parents that are saying, "Oh, I want somebody who has, a Harvard education, who plays volleyball, who has blue eyes," and they're willing to pay more for that, right?
Mm,
You can't do that in Spain. And so when you have the intended parents as the selectors, they're consumers, and then the eggs and the donor become a product that they're paying for, rather than um, an a donation that's going to help them. It becomes something different. And so and this is something I'll be talking about in my book, exactly how this consumerism in the American market
yeah, the
really drives a
commodification.
tiered market in human eggs, where some people are considered to have more reproductive value than others.
I guess my worry and my question, and I'm looking at this, and the only reason why this would concern me is because obviously understanding the history of the United States, I guess
Right.
my concern would be is, would that allow agencies to be partnering recipient parents and donors with, I would say, more malicious eugenic intents?
Well, I mean, that's happening anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it is.
I
I
mean,
guess that would worry me is, why are they, that would be my concern.
no, and that's a legitimate concern, and it's also, I think, something that's already happening. I mean, if I look at in my data, and again, this is going to be in my book, but if I look at my quantitative data
Mhm.
on how much donors were paid by race, okay, so I can see Asian donors and select white donors. Their highest compensation is like in my data is about $50,000 to $60,000. The highest I've heard is $250,000 for one cycle with a Chinese American donor at MIT. Right.
Wow.
And if you look at, for example, Hispanic and Black donors, their highest paid cycles are about $12,000. So there's a huge gap, a huge pay gap between the highest paid of Black and Hispanic donors compared to white and Asian donors, which already represents some of the discrepancies we have in compensation for other aspects of work in the United States. And so you do see these eugenic kinds of things happening
Yeah.
anyway. And if I look at the median compensation, the average compensation for Black and Hispanic and donors is between like 7 to 8,000, whereas the average compensation for white and Asian donors in my study is about 10 to 12,000. So I don't have equal representative samples of all groups,
Mhm.
but it does show you some trends of some of the concerns that we see how these kinds of structures operate in the society, and egg donation sort of magnifies
Yeah.
all the things that are already problematic regarding equity.
Well, I also think it's harder. I would assume it's a lot harder for you to get equal representation because when it comes to Black donors, there are not many,
And
which is
why?
and
Because they're
why?
not being compensated. They're not being enticed to the same degree as, you see all the time advertisements, Asian donor needed $50,000, blah, 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 or higher.
Hmm.
How often have you seen, Black donor needed $100,000? You don't see it.
Hmm.
And so there's no equity in terms, not that that's a good thing in either case, but what I'm saying is that you
Yeah.
don't see the enticements to recruit donors the same for those groups as you do for these groups. And then, of course, African American women and Hispanic women who want
Yeah.
donors who look like them have a harder time, finding donors because they're not being incentivized to the same degree as other donors are to be recruited into the industry in the first place. Then also, especially for Black women, there's, you know, um, and rightfully so, a long history of problems within the medical system, of experiencing racism in the medical system.
Well,
And so when
especially
you
when we talk
add that
about,
to a medical procedure,
yeah,
there could be some legitimate concerns about even entering into that system as a patient. So
absolutely. Well, especially
yeah,
when we go into like the history of gynecology or anything.
right.
I mean, we have entered into, the fifth circle of hell when we come to the history of
Right.
Black women and this particular um, medical industry. Um, and it's also what one of the observations that I've seen is the fertility industry in terms of the doctors it is primarily a white industry. It is
Right.
run by white doctors. You go to an ASRM conference, for anybody who doesn't know what that is,
Yeah.
ASRM is the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. They
Yeah.
constitute the guidelines for the clinics and banks to follow, not regulations, guidelines.
Yeah.
So they are optional. But you go to an ASRM conference and you're going to look around and you're be like, oh, there's not a lot of diversity. I see a lot of mayonnaise. It is not a
Exactly.
welcoming environment to anyone of color.
In fact, last year, I believe, because I've gone the last 4 or 5 years, and last year was one of the first times. Last year and the year before. The year before, I went to a reproductive justice working group at the ASRM, but it wasn't sort of a public
Hmm.
group. It wasn't part of the. It was, there were predominantly Black physicians and so on in this reproductive justice group, and they were trying to sort through, why is it so hard to find a Black egg donor, for example,
Hmm.
or sperm donor. And so they were raising some of those concerns 2 years ago. So at this last ASRM meeting in 2022, October
Hmm.
2022, was the first time that I have seen anyone speak about reproductive justice in the context of an ASRM meeting. And that was Valerie Montgomery Rice, a physician who gave the plenary congress at the ASRM. And I was very, very pleasantly, obviously, surprised that, like, oh, finally. But then again, like, well, reproductive justice has been talked about for decades,
Yeah.
and now it's finally 2023. But at least there's a platform for having these kinds of discussions about
Yeah.
race and medicine and justice. So
Well,
it was very inspiring to see her plenary congress lecture.
I agree. It is good that we're taking these steps. I do think that unfortunately it's because ASRM's hand is sort of being forced due to genetic testing, because there's
Uh,
been so much that has been unveiled in the last 5-10 years. Because
yeah,
we're only at 17% of the United States population has taken a commercial DNA test, and look what we've already found.
right, yeah,
And I do think that it is ASRM trying very hard to go, oh shit, let's get ahead of it, which I
uh-huh.
think they need to do. I think that there is way more steps and they should go way farther than what they're doing. But I do think it is because their hand is getting forced, in my personal
Well,
opinion.
well, and especially when it comes to donor conception, there was was it the Donor Conceived Council and the Right to Know groups are starting to really push the ASRM
Hmm.
to address issues surrounding, you know, open identity donation,
Yes.
the Colorado bill, which people were very upset about. Some people were very upset about, but some people were overjoyed about that.
Yeah.
That essentially banned anonymous donation in the state of Colorado. That was last year, and so I think the industry is seeing these social changes taking place, driven by donor-conceived people,
Yeah.
and they're saying, "Oh, we need to do something about this." So, I was part of that group, that the stakeholders meeting in Los Angeles that we had prior to the ASRM conference, and then the conference, and so on. And now the ASRM has actually got a committee to look at donor anonymity and open identity, and to start to explore these issues, including the perceptions of including donor conceived people.
Which is great.
Right.
I will say, they need to step it up a little bit, because
Well,
right now we aren't even in like an amuse-bouche territory. We're sort of like still talking about the menu, and it's like,
right.
guys, like, I'm getting a little tired, I would say, of the industry referring to us as angry DCP. And it's like, oh,
Right.
that's a little gaslighty, guys. Thank you so much.
Right.
It's not like we're dying or anything.
Right, right. Well, yeah, I mean, that is true. The more needs to be done,
Yeah.
and the door is opening somewhat. It's like here when it needs to be here,
Yeah.
right? So at least these conversations are starting to take place. I can imagine one would be justly annoyed by being labeled angry anything, especially,
Yeah.
and even if somebody was angry, well, they have the right to be angry.
We have very good reason to be angry. I
Yeah,
believe that anger is
exactly.
actually the understandable response given what many of us have gone through and
Right.
discovered. But I would
Yeah,
love to bring us back to egg donation, because a big
of
reason
course.
why I specifically wanted to have you on was,
Yes.
as somebody who operates so much on social media, specifically on TikTok, I see consistently all the time cryobanks and clinics recruiting donors, and they're
Yes.
doing little dancy videos and showing like, sell your eggs, buy a Prada bag, or
Right.
literally pay for your spring break with donations,
Right.
by being a donor. And I see this consistently, and I see 15-year-old girls going like, oh my god, I'm going to do this when I'm older.
Ugh, yeah.
And there's no context. It's so, I mean, sugar coated isn't even the correct word. It's
Right.
just, to me, it is just flat out misleading of what being a donor, and I hate the word donor because you're getting compensated extraordinarily well in the United States.
Yeah,
But
but I actually have a pushback on that,
please,
because in medical language, donor and recipient only mean the body that it's coming from versus the body that it's going to.
mhm,
So it doesn't have the same lay meaning as altruistic, like as we have
mhm,
in sort of our lay language of meaning altruistic or philanthropic.
yeah,
So donor in the medical context is like just the person something's coming from, whether it's blood, sperm, eggs, bone marrow, whatever. And so how I like to think about it is actually is compensated or paid donation versus unpaid donation.
mm,
So I still think that the term donation works when you think about it in terms of how things are medically defined. But if you start to put the more social definitions that we use in the general population about philanthropy, then obviously it doesn't work. So,
yeah.
so for a while I was saying egg provider, and then I started thinking about it. And then I looked up, well, I wonder what donation means in a medical dictionary. And so then I kind of came back to like, okay, well, I'm going to talk about it this way as compensated or paid donation, as
Mm.
opposed to, yeah. But anyway,
So, and it's a big reason why I wanted to bring you on, was talking about side effects
right,
and what egg donors go through and what it actually means to be an egg donor, because the way that
right,
so many of these clinics and cryobanks are presenting being an egg donor is solve all your problems through egg donation. It's like they make it sound like you
yeah,
are, I don't know, like they make it sound like you're chopping off an inch of your hair and handing it over. They make it sound
yeah,
as simple and easy and straightforward and flowery as possible.
exactly,
And it really, it one adds to just the commodification, which I can't stand, because they're literally comparing donor conceived people to a handbag. It's
right,
perpetuating the commodification, and these kids have no idea what they are entering into.
Yep.
So I would love to just start from square one, just so that everybody,
Yeah.
so we can just walk through it very, very simply, is what is the process of egg donation? Because we all know the process of sperm donation. It's quite
Right.
simple. They can donate sperm in their car. It's a very simple process.
Right.
So lead us through
Okay.
medically what egg donation is.
Okay. So once a donor goes through the screening process and makes it through and is accepted into a donation program, if she's doing the process might vary a little bit, whether depending upon whether she's doing what's called a fresh donation,
Mhm.
meaning an intended parent is ready and waiting to receive the eggs from that donor for a cycle right now, versus a frozen donation, meaning that those eggs are going to be frozen and then distributed later or
Okay.
used later. So if you're doing a fresh donation and you have to sync your cycle with the cycle of an intended mother or a gestational surrogate, as is often the case too, you first start off on birth control pills to sync the two cycles so that you can match up when each individual will be ovulating, so that when the embryo transfer goes, the recipient is ready to receive it, right?
Mhm.
In terms of her body. So after you do the birth control pills for, I think it's usually about several weeks, then you will start on hormone injections, and you'll be giving injections to yourself daily. So there's a daily hormone injection, and what those hormones do. So normally in a given month, you ovulate and one egg goes through, right? But your ovaries contain what's called follicles. So each ovary has a bunch of follicles, right? And the number of follicles vary from month to month. They vary from woman to woman, and they vary throughout your age. Once you hit menopause, you don't have it anymore, right? So when the physician in some of your initial testing will do what's called an ultrasound, transvaginal ultrasound, and they'll look to see how many follicles are in each of your ovaries, and that's called your resting antifollicle count. And so what that physician will do is they'll say, okay, I see she's got about 10 in this ovary and about 10 in this ovary. I'm going to give her this dosage of injections to try to get as many as we can, and hopefully without causing harm to the donor.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that number of follicles, remember, can vary.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might have 10 follicles, and some people you might see 40 because they have like polycystic ovarian syndrome or something.
Mm-hmm.
So in any case, they do the ultrasound, the transvaginal ultrasound. They see how many follicles you have, and then they try to decide your dosages, your hormone protocol based upon how many your levels, your AMH levels, your ultrasound, your follicle count, resting antifollicle count, and other things. So then for a period of a couple of weeks, you'll be taking those hormone injections. And then about 48 hours before you're due to ovulate, or before you're due to have the egg retrieval, you take what's called a trigger shot. Now, the trigger shot can either be HCG combined with HCG and often Lupron or Peptorelin, which is called a GnRHA agonist,
Mm-hmm.
or it can just be an agonist trigger like Lupron.
Mm-hmm.
In my own data, I've seen that donors with HCG in their trigger shots have a much higher rate of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which is a potentially life-threatening condition that could put you in the hospital or could kill you. I had 5 donors in my study who almost died from ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome and were hospitalized for 5 days to longer. In my study, I have I don't have the data in front of me. I think 15% of the donors in my study had severe ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome on at least one cycle. And doctors will often say that it never happens, that we use a Lupron trigger, you won't get it. But if you have a high number of eggs,
In
like
your
over
most
20
recent
eggs,
article, you interviewed 420 egg donors, and 289 of the respondents were overstimulated.
No, not that. It wasn't the 289. It was a portion of that 289.
Hold on.
Let's see, where's the article? So 26% had moderate OHSS on one cycle or more. 45% had none. 9% had severe on one cycle or more, and 1.8% had critical, which meant they were hospitalized.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I broke it down in this graph by trigger type and number of eggs produced, and I can see that donors that produced greater than 20 eggs per cycle were at a much higher risk of OHSS than donors who had fewer eggs per cycle. And that risk was increased if they had any HCG in the trigger. Now, for some reason, some doctors are still using HCG triggers in their donors. There's some belief out there that the HCG trigger improves embryo quality, which has also been disproven by other studies. So a lot of it is sort of personal preference by the physician.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, so the egg donation process involves several weeks of taking hormone injections. And then when it comes to the retrieval, 48 hours after the trigger shot, the donor will go will have surgery, usually under anesthesia, to remove the eggs from the follicles, the
Mm-hmm.
oocytes from the follicles. And that process, like I said, is usually under anesthesia. They take a they take a ultrasound guided needle.
Mm-hmm.
They poke it up through the vaginal canal to reach the ovary, and it pierces each of the follicles in the one ovary to get all the eggs, and then goes up to the other ovary again through the vaginal canal to pierce through all the other
Mm-hmm.
follicles to retrieve the eggs. And that process usually takes about 30 minutes.
Okay.
Did
Thank
I
you.
explain that well?
That was so beautifully orchestrated. Like, I've obviously been walked through the process many times, but I have to say that was my favorite. I thank you. That was wonderful. To piggyback off of what you just said, because you mentioned screenings, because the biggest question that I get all the time was, what are legally egg donors screened for versus sperm donors? Number one question I get all the time.
Legally?
Yes. So we're not talking about ASRM guidelines. We're not talking about bank policy. We're talking about regulations.
I don't know that there's much of a difference there. Have you heard otherwise?
Nope. It is STDs, and that is it.
Yeah, I think STDs, which sperm donors get screened for too.
Mm-hmm. By the FDA.
A lot of egg donors get screened for. Some places do genetic testing, some places don't.
But there's no regulation. That is all purely
no regulation on. Yeah,
it's all
there's
up
no
to bank policy.
This has to be done, that has to be done. No, but most clinics are going to do. They're going to test for STDs. They're going to test for some sort of carrier. They'll do some sort of basic carrier screening. For example, if
but again, it's not
Jewish,
regulated.
They might test for Tay-Sachs. I'm sorry.
But again, it's not regulated. This isn't this is not a law. This is ASRM guidelines, which again are fully optional. Because this is a big misunderstanding that I think I would say society has, is they really think that egg donors are absolutely 100%, like they have to be screened more legally than sperm donors are. And it's a big misconception that a lot of people have.
Yeah, no, I mean, the medical screening is the medical screening, and it's going to be down to sort of, is this person going to pass on a disease or not? Okay. And obviously you don't want to have STDs for a variety of reasons. I'm not exactly, but in any case, for both groups, and even for both groups, they do most standards of practice from what I've seen from clinic to clinic. Most do they do blood tests. They do, sometimes they do genetic counseling. So the genetic counselor might walk them through, okay, did your father have this? Did your grandfather have that? Did your grandmother have this? Blah, 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 that kind of thing. And most do want to do some sort of screening because they want the intended parents to feel like, okay, I've got a good donor. I've got somebody who's healthy. Mm-hmm. So, but like in one case, a genetics counselor that I interviewed told me that intended parents that she talks to would much rather have a donor with a family history of cancer than a donor with a family history of ADHD. Because cancer is something that's going to happen down the road that maybe there'll be a cure for, whereas ADHD is going to be something that you have to deal with as a parent.
Okay, so I don't really know how to unpack that one. All right.
Exactly.
All right.
That was one of the very interesting, and especially when you look at sort of neurodivergence and ADHD is part of neurodivergence, there's a lot of people with ADHD that have a lot of skills that do really good things in the world. So it's really interesting to me that is considered to be more problematic than cancer, which is lethal. But in any case,
All right. It's interesting. As somebody
Yeah.
who is currently in the process of getting an ADHD diagnosis, thank you so much, recipient parent.
Well,
I
yeah,
lovely to
yeah.
know that.
I supposedly have ADHD too, so go figure. You
Yeah.
know. Yeah,
Okay.
sure. It was a pain in the ass for my parents, but here I am on your podcast
But
talking
here
about
you
egg
are,
donation.
changing the game and doing incredible research. Um,
Right.
okay, so then if we basically again, we're sort of just mapping out, I'm going to say, like, the egg donor plane for everybody.
Right.
So there's no regulations in terms of donor screening, which means that it's going to be inconsistent depending, like,
Exactly.
you go to one clinic, one cryobank, they're each going to do different things.
Right.
My next question would be, how much, I know that you're certainly doing this, but I would say beyond yourself, how much research has been done on short-term and long-term side effects of being an egg donor?
Not much. I think,
Mm.
and I think there's a handful. I what's her? Trying to figure out people's names. I think Kawas. I can't. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Kawass. She did a survey on egg donors. Let me see. I'm googling her right now. Da, 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 da. Jennifer Kawas did a survey on egg donors. Oh gosh, I can't believe these things aren't at the top of my head.
You're doing great. You are nailing it. I don't expect everybody to have all of this stuff on that. I have my notes out right now.
Okay,
You kidding me?
normally I would have this like boom off the top of my head, but here now I have to look up my own articles to find out who I cited.
I love that.
Okay, Kawass. So yeah, from a medical standpoint, in terms of looking at the risks for egg donors, there are not very many
Yeah.
studies out there. One study by Jennifer Kawas looks at trends and outcomes for donor oocytes in the United States from 2000 to 2010. I believe they found, again, somewhat higher OHSS rates than the 1% that's usually cited by medical
Mhm.
doctors during the informed consent process for donors.
Mm.
And Kenny also did egg donors retrospective evaluations of their motivations, expectations, and experiences during their donation cycles. So I know of about a handful of people who have specifically looked at the medical aspects somewhat,
Mhm.
but not any real long-term studies, especially with the volume of donors, the number of donors that I have. I haven't seen any US studies that have been that detailed in terms of looking at short and long-term risks for egg donors. And the long-term risks is really difficult to look
Yeah.
at and to, with any kind of insurance that it's going to be accurate, because I can say, okay, I have 5 egg donors in my study that had cancer
Mhm.
within 1 to 10 years post donation. Well,
Yeah.
1 year post donation, that is a little suspicious.
Yeah.
But 10 years, who's to say they wouldn't have had
Yeah.
that cancer anyway? I can say, for example, one of the donors in my study, actually somebody I interviewed for my film as well, she donated 3 times starting at age 26, and shortly during her 3rd cycle, or she discovered she had a growth on her cervix. And then after her 3rd cycle, she about a year after, she didn't have medical insurance, so she didn't go to the doctor right away. But then she started bleeding, and she discovered finally by going to the doctor that she had cervical cancer, and that was within a year. She was diagnosed within about a year and a half of having been an egg donor. And the strange thing about her cervical cancer was that her own doctor told her that that specific kind of cancer would only be found in an 80-year-old, and even then it's extremely rare. So her own doctor told her that he thought that the hormones that she had taken as an egg donor contributed to her cervical cancer. So she had to have the tumor removed. She was told she was never going to be able to have her own children, and so she, had 3 other families out there that had her biological children, and she was told she was never going to be able to have any. Now, miraculously, the positive to the story is that after her surgery to remove the cancer, I guess it opened up her cervix enough to where she went on a vacation with her boyfriend and conceived and did have a child, but she was not able to deliver. Bless you. She was not able to deliver vaginally because her cervix was so scarred it couldn't dilate, and that was likely the only child she would ever have.
So I assume then it was like a C-section?
Yes, she had a C-section. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
no, I've heard lots of anecdotal stories about, does egg donation cause cervical cancer? That is something that you have heard there, and there, I would say, at least in my groups, there's been enough whispers of it that it would be something that, like, I would really love to see more of, like, a bigger study on it.
Right.
Because obviously, you know, that's a pretty big side effect.
Right. And that's actually one of the things, like in my study, you know, I have it set up so that if somebody enters, you know, the study on my website, eggdonorresearch.org or eggdonorresearch.com, you go to the website, you click join the study, right? And it'll take you through a few filtering questions. So if somebody had been an egg donor, if they are just about to start their first egg donation, if they have frozen their eggs, so I'm doing egg freezing as well, and if they've already participated in an earlier survey and want to update their information. So there's 4 different surveys depending upon where people are. And so if somebody's already taken my egg donor survey, they can go back, you know, a year later, 2 years later, and take an updated survey that will follow up from where they left off before. So it'll be a new survey on if they have anything to report regarding medical changes since taking the prior survey. And then if I can get enough pre-donation donors, right, and then start following them through for 10 years. So I've got it set up so that I can do that. I just need the funding to be able to do that. And the funding is the big piece, because you know, several years ago I contacted program officers at the National Institutes of Health, and specifically the fertility sector as well as other sections. And I was told by the fertility section program officer, what do egg donors have to do with infertility? They don't have anything to do with infertility. It doesn't make sense, you know, what you want to do.
Are you serious?
I am serious. So there's literally no incentive to even provide funding to examine this question when it in the NIH, because it's not on their radar of things to examine.
What do egg donors have to do with okay, yeah, sure. Okay.
He literally told me egg donors have nothing to do with infertility.
Yeah, and what does flour have to do with baking? I don't know.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I said, well, you know, some of the egg donors in my study have gone on to experience their own infertility later. And he's like, well, then that's a different study. And I'm like,
we're having some cognitive dissonance here.
Yeah, well, exactly. It really just comes down to, I think, there's just a lack of incentive of wanting to do that kind of research as far as the industry.
Well, it will not be profitable for the industry.
That will end up, you know, deterring women from donating eggs more than mandatory non-anonymity.
Absolutely, you know? That will. But let's keep going. Let's keep talking about side effects. And for everybody, I will be dropping some of these links, because right now I'm looking right now at what you did with Science Direct, alignment between expectations, experience of egg donors. What does it mean to be informed? Which was extremely interesting, because it was all about informed consent. And I would love to, in your findings, what are the short-term and long-term side effects that doctors are warning their patients of? What are the side effects that you feel like they're not really warning of? And if you can go into sort of those percentages of informed consent, I would love for you to do that. Okay.
So across the board, most of the donors I've spoken to and most of the donors who have taken my survey, and now it's at about 1,000, so substantially more than when I wrote those articles, but I'm still analyzing that data. But in most cases, donors tell me that when they sign the informed consent form, they're counseled through the process, right? They receive some, and they might be told, you know, that there's risks of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. And then when they ask, okay, well, what is that? What's this OHSS thing? What does that mean? They'll be told, oh, you don't have to worry about it. The risks are less than 1%. It's not going to happen to you. And so that's the main thing so you have this informed consent, but the informed consent is sort of taken away in that process of counseling because they're told not to worry about the thing they're being informed about.
Yeah, that doesn't sound
And
like
so
informed consent. That sounds like informed consent with an asterisk.
It's disinformed consent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's not.
So you put this sheet out there because they have to cover their bases.
Mm-hmm.
But in the counseling process, if a donor expresses concern or a prospective donor expresses concern, she's told not to be concerned about that. So that's the number one is that the informed consent really needs to be more informed and yeah. So that's the main challenge right there. And then when it comes to the long-term risks, they often are told things like, there's no evidence of any long-term risk. No studies show any long-term risks for donors. Well, how many studies have been done on long-term risks for donors?
I believe we covered that of saying not many.
Zero.
Yeah.
Because even I haven't looked substantially at the long-term risks yet because of the amount of work and the amount of funding it'll take to do that.
Yeah.
So when it comes to long-term risks, we really don't know anything because there's no data out there. And so absence of evidence does not mean absence of a problem. So the informed consent process, whether it's for short-term or long-term risks, is really problematic, and it actually operates to sort of smooth over the donor's concerns rather than give her truly informed consent that tells her, yes, some studies show that 12% of donors may get ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, but here's what we're going to do to try to prevent that. We're going to give you an agonist trigger rather than one with HCG, and this is what that means. We're going to aim for 20 eggs rather than 40, and this is what that means. And so I'm hoping that my other article on ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome in egg donors, I'm hoping that some people in the medical community will actually read that and say, oh, yeah, this is a problem. I'm going to make sure to sort of look at my protocol, look at my OHSS rates in my donors, and see if there's any way I can make an adjustment to make it more comfortable for them.
To all of my listeners, I will have all of the links that all of the articles and everything within the caption. So it's all there for you to read. I highly, highly suggest that you do read it. One of the things when reading the article that really kind of, I knew this happened, but seeing it in black and white in your article, the fact that there are so many clinics and cryobanks that after the donor would be overstimulated for a cycle, they would continue retrieving eggs for more cycles. I would have, that to me was very shocking as to going if you overstimulated your egg, you don't use that egg donor anymore.
Exactly.
That just puts them in the danger.
Well, yeah, and my data shows in that OHSS article, it shows that if you had OHSS one time, moderate or higher, you are 35%. You have a 35% more likelihood of having severe OHS again. So if you've had it once, you should not ever donate again. And I've got some donors in my study that have done between 10 and 19 cycles. One donor did 10 cycles after having had severe OHSS that landed her in the hospital for a week where she almost died. She still donated again because the clinic contacted her, or the agency contacted and said, oh, we've got somebody who wants to do a sibling cycle, because they already have a baby with a child with your eggs, and they want a sister or brother. Can you please come back again? And so this donor felt like she couldn't say no because she has sisters and brothers and she knows how much they mean to them.
That is so irresponsible.
So it's the emotional manipulation in some places that brings them back in and makes it so they can't say no. They feel guilty if they say no because they put themselves. There are many donors that I'm finding. I mean, it's individual to individual, but I'm finding that many are highly empathic, and so they put themselves in the shoes of the intended parent rather than thinking about themselves first.
Yeah.
And so, and the industry supports that empathy, and they feed the empathy rather than saying, oh, you need to take care of yourself first.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I see happening and it starts from the moment of recruitment all the way through subsequent cycles. The moment of recruitment, the donor is being told, oh, this is such a great thing you're doing for somebody else. Oh, this is a win-win. You're helping somebody, but you're getting some help with your student loan debt at the same time, or whatever. And they flash all those, like you're talking about the TikTok ads earlier, buy a purse, go on vacation.
Yeah.
And the data that I was just analyzing for my book, rarely do U.S. donors use much of the compensation that they receive for things like handbags or vacations or luxury items. The majority of the donors in the United States use the compensation for debt, student loan debt, credit card debt, tuition debt. Very rarely is it for anything superfluous, like anything like a car or like I said, a purse or things like that.
And then it kind of goes into there's again, I have like 10,000 questions right now, and it also, to me, it's, so you're preying upon people because as you certainly well know, you have these clinics and cryobanks go set up pop-up tents at these college campuses where they know these kids are. I mean, I understand they're 18 years old, but I'm sorry, that's still a kid.
I had one donor that she started looking into it at 16. So she's probably one of your TikTok people that you're talking about, and finally donated at 17 with her mom's permission.
Are you serious?
17. She's not even old enough to sign a legal contract yet.
Oh my God.
How is a 17-year-old able to make that decision? Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's like, to me, it's just predatory. And, for me, I refer to it's egg poaching, which,
It is.
It's
poached egg.
It's a poached egg. And you are
one of the chapters in my book is called Poached. So yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, and that's another thing I see with the Spanish system that I fully agree with, that we do not have here. In the Spanish system, by law, they cannot have any advertisements. A clinic, an egg bank cannot have any advertisements with a dollar amount in there.
Good.
And they are absolutely prohibited from recruiting on college campuses. They can't have advertisements at college campuses or any of it.
That is a game changer right there.
Yep.
Oh my God, that is a dream right there.
Yep. Now, the main mechanism of recruiting in Spain is, a donor comes in, she finds out about it, and then she brings her friends. And she might get a little incentive, like a little bonus for bringing her friends, for each of the friend that she brings in. So there's not always, perfect.
We're not 100% perfect, but I will say, it is better.
Right.
That is a lot better. I would prefer, oh my God, but that's so much better.
And I would love to see legislation like that pass here. No college campus advertisements, no college campus visits, and no money associated with the advertisements. I think those would be three key things. And then you would shift the ground as to, in terms of who's donating and how and what brings them to the table, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, speaking of hyperstimulation.
Yeah.
In your findings, because we talked about how many of your, in your group have been overstimulated. Are other countries having similar statistics? Where are you finding like similar, like, you have this percentage of donors getting overstimulated in the United States? Is there an equivalent finding in Spain or wherever else you have done your studies?
Well, that is a challenge to get that information, because in most other countries, nobody's tracking it either. In Spain, I believe they're tracking it. In Spain, they do have a registry. The registry is to track the number of live births per donor and the number of cycles per donor, but not to connect donor and offspring, obviously. But in any case, from my own observations in Spain, I'm seeing lower stimulation than here.
Okay.
I did see one retrieval with a donor who had been stimulated to produce 48 eggs in one cycle, which is quite high. I wasn't able to follow up with her afterwards to find out if she was okay, unfortunately, because I really would have liked to have been able to follow up with her. But for the most part, from the clinical, so in Spain, I was given access in the clinic they would just send me their donors. And I was very grateful to have, a couple of clinics had an office set up for me that I was able to the donors would come into me, and talk to me. And that's a different kind of filtering system than the way I recruited donors in the US sample. So potentially, it could be that the clinics I was working in had better practices, because if you have better practices, you're not going to feel challenged by somebody coming in and observing your practices, right? But in any case, so most of the clinics that I was involved with in Spain, I did see more conservative. I did see happier donors. Okay. So I didn't get as many complaint donors that had complained about problems post donation. Okay. There might have been, out of 127, there might have been a handful. But and they do use different protocols there. But again, in Spain, I think, and here as well, I think the shift away from private clinics to private equity funded venture capitalist backed clinics is causing a shift in business practices within the clinic to be more on, okay, we need more eggs because more eggs equals more dollars or more euros, as the case may be. So I think that the egg freezing and the shift towards private equity VC backed clinics where you're getting these large global groups is really having an impact on clinical practice. That's sort of my hypothesis that I'm working right now as I'm working through this book. But just is what I see. But also in Spain, they reported the national averages, I think in 2020, of eggs produced per cycle is 16. Whereas in my data, the average number of eggs produced per cycle is 25, with a low of like 5 or 6 and a high of 80. So,
and you're referring to the United States with that one?
In my US data, yeah.
Now, okay, okay. So kind of piggybacking off of that, there is an ASRM guideline that says that you should only be doing 6 cycles of donations.
Right.
And it doesn't seem like clinics and cryobanks are sticking to that guideline. Why would it, in your medical opinion, be important? Why is it important to stick to those 6 cycles? And how often are you seeing clinics and cryobanks not following that ASRM guideline?
Good questions. Okay, so it's important. Every cycle you do is exposure to risk. So yeah, you might be able to get away with it 19 times, like one of the donors in my study did. 19 times. You might be able to, but you don't know what the long-term ramifications are going to be, or even the short-term ramifications. And like some of the things that I've seen in my study, I can have a donor that in my survey, I'm asking some of the medical information for each cycle. Okay, so I'm collecting per cycle data. So she might have had no problem cycles 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then all of a sudden cycle 6 gets hyperstimulated, gets ovarian torsion, has to have an ovary removed, or what have you, and has a huge problem. So every single cycle, you're setting your risk factor all over again. And there's some possibility, and I allude to this in the OHSS article, that a person's body, after doing repeat cycles like that, might be becoming more sensitive to the medications potentially or something, and be at increased risk with each cycle that they do. So 6 cycles seems to be sort of what the ASRM is saying in terms of, potential unknown risks. And then also the concerns are consanguinity, with egg donors or sperm donors, not having too many offspring from a single donor that might meet and end up, having a relationship, which is obviously a huge concern for donor conceived people.
We would like to turn down that banjo music. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And then your second question was... medically, number of cycles.
Was how often are you seeing clinics and banks go past that ASRM guideline of 6 cycles only?
Right. I see some clinics. This is coming from the donor side, the donor's perspective, but also I've talked to a number of professionals and so on as well. So some clinics adhere pretty well to that guideline.
Okay.
They might push for a 7th cycle for a sibling cycle, for example. But most of the ASRM, branded whatever clinics are kind of sticking to that guideline pretty much. But I do see a substantial number of donors. And again, I have the data right here. Hold on a second. I do see a substantial number of donors doing beyond the 6. So I can actually pull up my chapter that I'm working on right now.
Also in the United States, there isn't a like donor registry. So you can have a donor go to one clinic and maybe that clinic will do 6 cycles, but then they can hop to the other.
Exactly. So, so average number of cycles that I have in my data is 3.3 for U.S. donors, but the range is 1 to 19. Do I have how many
19.
have gone? Oh, it's in the other article. Sorry. So, but I do have again a lot of donors that do that 7, 8, 9, 10 up to 19 cycles. And is it widespread practice? Probably more widespread than we would like. Obviously, from the clinical standpoint, screening a donor is expensive.
Yeah.
They have to do all the blood tests. They have to, it's labor intensive. It's expensive. And so the more they can use a donor to repeat, the less she costs up front, right? If you cancel somebody out at cycle 6 and start all over again with somebody else, you have to do, more screening and so on. So if you can maximize the number of donations out of a single donor, you're going to save yourself money on the one hand. And also, like you just were saying, donors who, because there's no registry, a donor who's done 6 cycles can easily jump to another agency, jump to another clinic, and nobody's going to necessarily know how many she's done. Now, from the donors I've spoken to, that has been on the rare side. More common is them feeling like either addicted to the process and nobody stops them, or being sort of not coerced, but being sort of guided to doing another cycle because, they have that guideline, but it doesn't really mean anything. So that's kind of what I've been hearing. Yeah.
And then, again, following up, thank you. And following up on eggs retrieved, because you were talking about the difference that you were saying that you noticed that in the United States, they were retrieving more eggs per cycle and in Spain, less eggs per.
Right.
Is there an ASRM guideline talking about how many eggs should be retrieved per cycle? Or does ASRM not have a guideline referring to that?
ASRM does not have a guideline referring to that as far as I know.
Okay.
However, back in, 20-something, 2006, I think it was, in California, when California was grappling with this idea of using eggs for research. The California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, there was a huge, it's in the Institute of Medicine reports. In this report, when they're talking about getting donor eggs for research purposes, and one of the things was you can't compensate donors for research eggs at the time. Now, unfortunately, you can. And another guideline another thing that was mentioned in that report was donor cycles in which a donor produces greater than 20 eggs should be canceled due to for safety for the donor. So some of the guidelines that are out there that's been spoken to using data have said that if a person's producing greater than 20 eggs, the cancel should be cycled. The cycle should be canceled. Not the cancel should be cycled. And my own data with egg donors also points to increased risk once you hit over that 20 mark. So,
and it's an increased risk for overstimulation?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And why do you think in your findings are more eggs getting retrieved in the United States versus Spain? Is it a difference in drugs? Is it a dosage in drugs? What do you think is causing that?
Well, first of all, I need to clarify, we don't have, as far as I can tell, any center that's collecting that data.
Okay.
So it's not a national statistic. It's my own data that.
Understand. Love that little asterisk.
Yeah. I believe SART, the Society for Assisted Reproduction and Technology, might collect some of that eggs per cycle data from participating clinics. But even as a researcher and an ASRM member myself, I am not able to access, I have not been able to access that data.
Okay.
So I don't know national averages, what it is. However, to answer that question, I think one of the big things behind egg quantity has to do with this changing practices surrounding because of vitrification, because of egg freezing capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So now with egg banks, for example, you have the capacity to split up batches of eggs, freeze them, and distribute them around the world, right? So, and for example, there's, again, from my book, there's one, nobody's going to need to buy it because I'm covering it all here. But in any case,
buy the book, everybody. Buy the book.
Next fall. But in any case, we can do another one of these when it comes out.
Perfect. I'd love that.
So in any case,
that would be excellent.
Exactly. I went to this one egg agency bank that works hand in hand with a clinic in Los Angeles,
mm-hmm.
and I interviewed this woman there. I'll call her Lucy, and I interviewed her for my documentary, actually, but I'm using part of it in the book. And she talked about how they had this one donor that just produced 78 eggs, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of eggs. She's like, oh yeah, it was like a home run for us. And what we did is we, package them up and we put them in the egg bank. We sell, batches of 5 to 3 sets of intended parents fresh. We put the rest in the egg bank, and we can sell those batches of 5 later. And, each of those intended parents got pregnant. So it was a win-win for everybody. And so I started doing the math. Okay. If you have a 1-to-1 donation and that egg donor is getting paid $7,500 to give all of her eggs to one intended parent, the clinic or egg bank or the clinic is making about, say the intended parents are paying, say, $20,000 for that one cycle with that one egg donor. She's making $7,500. However, what does an intended parent need with 78 eggs, right? They don't. They maybe need 10, to get a few good embryos. So with this frozen egg bank kind of model, what you can do is that intended parent can get whatever eggs they need to make an embryo. But if you break the eggs up into these batches of 5, you can sell each batch of 5 for $14,000. So rather than a clinic making $20,000 off of one donor, they're paying $7,500. You have a clinic that can take 78 eggs divided by 5, which is how many batches? Sell each of those for $14,000, and you could potentially make $200,000 off of a single donor rather than $20,000. So the model, the business model that comes with vitrification expands the profit potential exponentially compared to fresh donation. And I think that both in Spain and the United States, but particularly in the United States, I see that happened a lot with the donors in my study. In Spain, I see it less so, although there is one clinic in particular in Spain where other Spanish clinics are kind of critiquing them because they know that since this clinic went into this public, or into this private equity kind of funded practice, that their clinical practices have changed. So in Spain, I see more critique of that kind of a business model than I do here in the United States, where it's becoming more standard. Although in Spain also, their model for oocyte distribution is the clinic owns the eggs, not the intended parent. So any donor, whether they produce 10 eggs or whether they produce 20 or 50, any donor, all of those eggs belong to the clinic, and the clinic distributes as they see fit, not all to the intended parents. So,
well, we're coming down to the end of the podcast, and I'm pretty sure I could do a 5-part series with you very easily. But before we get to the end, is there anything that I have not covered that you're just like, this is what I really want your listeners to take away? Or this is one fact, one piece of the study that we haven't covered that I feel like is so important?
Well, I think we've covered a lot about risk, which is obviously my biggest concern for egg donors is the informed piece. And one of the things I think is really important for anybody considering egg donation to think about is that, and to be aware of, is that any egg bank, agency, clinic what have you. Sure, some are great, some are not so great, but their interests are not necessarily always aligned with your interests. And so even if it's your first time, you don't want to be a bother to the clinic, you don't want to ask too many questions because you're afraid you're going to get rejected, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of young women have told me, I was afraid to push back because I didn't want to get rejected.
Okay.
Well, if you get rejected for pushing back, that means you did the right thing for yourself.
Yes.
And so anybody who's considering egg donation, whether they're 15 on TikTok or whether they're 25, ask a lot of questions. Don't expect that you're going to get the correct answers. You will get the answers that you want to hear, and then continue to do the research, and then decide if it's going to be the right decision for you, because nobody is really going to have your best interests at heart like you will. And if you're finding that people are not answering your questions, then that's a sign that that's not an agency or a clinic or an egg bank that you want to work with.
I love this answer so much.
Thank you.
Love it. And not only do your own research, but maybe you should read Dr. Tober's books.
Yes,
and articles.
Yes. And my articles that you're going to be linking to, they're all open access.
Yeah.
And on my website, I haven't got a chance to it yet, but on my website, there's an our research tab, or a research tab, and I have some of my older articles available on that tab. And in that tab, I make sort of any of the presentations that I've given, like for example at ASRM, the posters and so on, I make those available there, and then I give a sort of in a nutshell, this is what this study means, right? So I break it down so somebody can walk away with the takeaway of,
great.
2/3 of egg donors feel uninformed about long-term risks, and one third feel uninformed about short-term risk, or whatever. So you can get that takeaway message broken down for you without having to go through all the data and the science speak. So I do encourage people to take a look at my websites on that regard. And then also, personally, I mean, it seems to me donors tend to be happier when they do one-to-one cycles, more so than those bank cycles where it's more anonymous and your eggs are split up, and there tends to be more of a personal touch with one-on-one cycles.
I can imagine that.
One intended parent to one egg donor kind of thing through a clinic, and just try to be informed and self-advocate. Oh, and also there's the We Are Egg Donors group. If people are considering egg donation, they can also look at the We Are Egg Donors Facebook groups and talk to other donors before making a decision.
And to also add to it, something that I would always encourage egg donors to do, and after listening to all of the explanations, especially when it comes to commodification, if you are interested in egg donation, I highly recommend looking at how the bank or clinic advertises and recruits donors. Look at the tactics and ask yourself, does this seem skeevy? Does this seem a little sleazy to you? And for me, I do absolutely consider any clinic that recruits donors actively on college campuses. That to me is a red flag. There are clinics that do not do that.
Yeah.
They are harder to find because they're not going to college campuses. But
and they might not pay as much, but yeah.
But when you're thinking about your life, your body, your health, you gotta do that. And it is absolutely, it's worth it, because I don't want you to end up as one of Dr. Tober's statistics.
Well, and to that point, I literally had an agency recruiter tell me that they go to sorority events on college campuses, and they schedule them with the sororities to go explain what they do, what egg donation means, and to recruit egg donors, and to sort of gloss over the process. And they'll often find groups of sorority sisters that think, oh, well, we can do this together, and it'll be sort of a bonding experience. And so,
lady, go to Miami. Miami. Go make waffles. That's your bonding activity. Like, what? And I know that they do the same thing with frat houses as well. With sperm donation. Yeah. Oh my God. Well, that's I know that they do it, but whenever I hear somebody like remind me, I'm just like, God, I need to go shower again. Damn it.
Yeah, I had another recruiter tell me that they specifically worked with intended parents from Asian donors
Mhm.
and Asian and predominantly Asian intended parents, and they told me that if they have an intended parent that wants a cellist, for example, they'll go out to a musical event, a student musical event, and try to like find a Chinese American cellist or whatever, and so they will go out and do
We're
targeted
not
recruiting.
Build-A-Bears, for crying out loud, guys. This is really
Yeah,
getting into the baby designer category. That is just,
yeah,
it
yeah,
is. I will say, as
yeah.
a donor conceived person, it just makes you feel. It makes you feel like a toy, a doll, a stuffed animal.
Right.
It's not a good feeling.
Yeah.
But Dr. Tober, I do not want to take up more of your time. I
Thank you.
cannot thank you enough for making the time to be on this podcast. I know that you are exceptionally busy with all the work that you are doing. And I want to say, as a donor conceived person, I thank you so much for doing this research because no one else is. And thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
because I make my sassy videos on TikTok trying to warn people who are recruiting on TikTok, but the only way that I'm able to do that is because of your research. So
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I thank you so much for everything that you are doing. I wish you nothing but luck in the future, and I cannot wait to read your new book and see your documentary.
Thanks. Thanks. Look, I enjoyed talking to you, and I look forward to seeing yours as well.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.